The revolutionary design of Resident Evil 4 changed the survival horror genre forever. The Resident Evil series has long been hailed as the leading survival horror paradigm dating back to 1996's original Resident Evil. But when that formula grew stale, Resident Evil 4 was tasked with reviving the series to prevent its cancellation. RE4 did more than that. It not only thrilled audiences, but also set the template for every third-person shooter to follow. However, this shift has drawn criticism from some critics. Resident Evil 4 has been accused of offering a story that is more action than horror. The action is pure goofiness, with Leon delivering a line, showing amazing athleticism and even talking to the camera in the opening scene. When Leon takes this ironic approach, it's hard to feel like he's actually in danger. Some have argued that these Hollywood B-movie tropes detract from RE4's sense of dread and arguably detract from the survival horror nature of the Resident Evil franchise and all subsequent survival horror games. Resident Evil 4 redefines survival horror by putting players in control. Resident Evil 4 director Shinji Mikami took a very different approach to survival horror than most critics and addressed their concerns by adding action to the game. There is a common belief in the West that survival horror games constantly put players at a disadvantage in order to maintain a sense of helplessness. This is why the characters in the best survival horror games are usually weak and relatively uncontrollable. But Mikami has a completely different definition of survival horror, seeing it as a game where fear and excitement meet. By this definition, action is the perfect ingredient to mix with horror. Resident Evil 4 improvements make RE4 the ultimate survival horror game. Mikami creates this motion integration, giving the player more control over the camera. In previous Resident Evil games, the camera was fixed in place, which not only overcame hardware limitations, but also added a cinematic stage effect to terrifying moments. However, to meet the action-oriented demands of today's gamers, this camera system needs to be replaced. Instead, Resident Evil 4 uses an over-the-shoulder perspective, which gives players more control over what they aim their weapons at and allows them to direct the action. This change has the added benefit of making Resident Evil's tank controls more intuitive and hiding enemies out of the player's view for more realistic scares. With this shift in perspective, RE4 gives Leon a larger arsenal to choose from. The extra firepower adds to Mikami's excitement through excessive violence, but the switch isn't just good for gameplay. Abundant resources force players to use ammo more frequently in the short term rather than trying to save it for hypothetical future situations. This adds to the tension as players must act decisively in order to survive. The opening village sequence is a perfect example of this philosophy, pitting Leon against a hive of enemies and challenging the player to make the most of limited resources. With this shift in perspective, RE4 gives Leon a larger arsenal to choose from. The extra firepower adds to Mikami's excitement through excessive violence, but the switch isn't just good for gameplay. Abundant resources force players to use ammo more frequently in the short term rather than trying to save it for hypothetical future situations. This increases tension as players need to act determined to survive. The sequence of opening ceremony is the perfect model for this concept. It compares Leon to a hive group of enemies and requires players to use limited resources for the best results. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and support my channel.